The NOAA National Weather Service forecasters are predicting above normal hurricane activity this year, including 4 to 7 major hurricanes. Aside from the obvious destruction this extreme weather brings, another threat looms underneath all of the chaos: human trafficking. Leanne McCallum DeSalle says natural disasters create plenty of vulnerabilities within communities for traffickers to exploit.
So natural disasters create housing instability, they create resource scarcity, folks lose their jobs and livelihoods. And so it's much easier to fall victim to exploitation because you may not have better alternatives. You might take that sketchy job because you no longer have your community where you worked or whatnot.
McCallum is a research analyst and training and technical assistance provider in the Victimization and Response Program at RTI International. She says these vulnerabilities evolve during the aftermath of a natural disaster. The first wave mainly affects those who've been directly impacted by the storm.
So that would be folks who lost their homes, family units that are disconnected, people who are already living in poverty or face discrimination. Disproportionately, people living in poverty are living in communities that are impacted by disasters. So, for example, they may be living in floodplains or in places that have higher incidences of disasters because of redlining and because of costs of living. And so those folks that may have fewer resources to support themselves after a disaster are more likely to be taken advantage of by a trafficker.
The second wave of vulnerability comes during the rebuilding phase. There are so many contractors hired to fix different parts of the community that it's tough to track how employees are being treated and if they're being paid.
The folks who are doing construction, who are rebuilding roads, who are repairing different things, those folks who tend to be migrant workers or low-wage workers are the most vulnerable because there are issues with enforcement. And there's a lot of money that goes into those contracts. And it's a really complex system of subcontractors and sometimes paying folks on the job site. And so it's really hard to track and really hard to enforce.
Even if a big corporation with strong workplace requirements is handling the rebuild, there's often multiple subcontractors involved down the line. McCallum says that the further removed these third-party workers are, the more challenging it is to enforce the same standards that the workers at the top receive. As these values fall through the cracks, many workers are taken advantage of. And while there are some federal structures in place to keep workers safe, such as the Davis-Bacon Act, even these laws aren't always enforced.
The Davis-Bacon Act ensures a minimum wage for government contractors on some of these large contracts, and it can be suspended in post-disaster settings in order to make sure that that rebuilding happens really quickly. But at times, what ends up happening is that workers are given exceptionally low wages. And so we see this whole spectrum of worker mistreatment and bad jobs all the way to the most serious, which is labor trafficking and labor exploitation, when someone is forced, tricked, or coerced into providing labor and services. And that whole gambit of bad labor can happen in post-disaster settings.
The third wave of vulnerability comes after the initial threats have been removed. So much of the community is left homeless and jobless, and kids aren't able to attend school or daycare. This disconnect removes the watchful eye of teachers and caretakers, leaving children vulnerable to exploitation.
We heard of cases of U.S. citizen children who were being trafficked by their parents post-disaster, to foreign national children who were in forced labor. We've heard from responders in Louisiana that they were noticing a rise in human trafficking post-disasters because kids weren't able to go to school where they could tell a trusted adult, this is happening to me.
The various studies conducted by RTI and the National Human Trafficking Hotline show that trafficking is a major blind spot for natural disaster response plans in America. McCallum says the international plans for responding to disasters, like ensuring access to food, safe water, and available housing, now includes victimization as well. And though America's response plan is different, she thinks we're finally starting to prioritize the threat of human trafficking.
And it really started emerging as a topic in the more public anti-trafficking discourse in the last maybe 4 or 5 years. But I think after Hurricane Katrina, there were several really major anti-trafficking cases that happened. Massive labor trafficking case that happened in the Signal International case, for example, in which migrant workers were exploited when they were working on oil rigs and repairing oil rigs. So some of those cases came into sort of the public awareness in those years after Katrina, but the public discourse really didn't start about it until recently.
Signal International is an Alabama-based marine construction firm. In 2015, they were found guilty of labor trafficking, fraud, racketeering, and discrimination, then ordered to pay 5 Indian men $12 million. It was the first trial of more than a dozen related lawsuits that ended up being one of the largest labor trafficking cases in American history. By 2012, there were nearly 4,000 cases of trafficking reported after Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf Coast region, which encompasses Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. These predators are able to thrive because law enforcement and responders are focused on saving lives and property, leaving little bandwidth for other threats.
And unfortunately, there are a lot of misconceptions about what trafficking looks like, that you can look at a situation and immediately know it's trafficking. And it's unfortunately really complex investigations are required to do that. And so the best thing for identifying these victims and survivors in post-disaster settings is through community relationships and services. So some of the folks who are best positioned to identify victims are actually healthcare workers or folks who are working in the services that are provided to displaced folks and folks impacted by disasters. For example, shelter workers or your FEMA disaster case managers are some of the people who are seeing these vulnerable folks day in and day out and can notice some of those signs of coercion and control.
McCallum helped conduct a 2023 study that surveyed disaster and anti-trafficking responders for major hurricanes in the Gulf Coast region since 2017. They wanted to understand the key challenges in addressing human trafficking during and after a disaster and figure out the best plan of action to protect communities.
And what we heard from them is that the more prepared they were, having multidisciplinary teams that brought together law enforcement, service providers, and disaster responders and healthcare providers, when they had those structures in place and working really well before the storm, they functioned much better after the storm. And so having those systems in place, having that collaboration in place at the local level, the regional level, and state level has been really important to maintain those human trafficking investigations and make sure that victims are being identified.
Another key aspect of preventing human trafficking is increasing access to housing.
The National Human Trafficking Hotline did a study a few years back, and they found that one of the most pressing vulnerabilities that trafficking victims after natural disasters faced was that they had lost their housing, and that's how traffickers had enticed them or exploited them. And that's something that impacts resilience workers and locals after a disaster. There's simply not enough housing. And so increasing that housing accessibility is really important in that immediate aftermath.
And since it can be so difficult to identify victims of trafficking in all of the chaos of a natural disaster, McCallum believes putting resources into prevention efforts can make a big difference. Workers can be protected by awareness campaigns that lay out all of their rights in clear and easy-to-understand terms. These programs should also educate workers on what exploitation can look like and give information on how to self-advocate and where they can report their concerns for help. You can find out more about human trafficking, Leanne McCallum DeSalle, and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our production manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Greg Johnson.